Welcome and thank you for joining us here today at the University of Maine School of Law. My name is Peter Pittigoff. I'm Dean of the University of Maine School of Law, and we're pleased to present the 4th Annual Governance and Ethics Symposium. This is a very timely topic this year, the crisis of trust in public and private sector institutions. This is no small matter. In fact, it's a critical issue today throughout our society. From business to nonprofit organizations, from financial systems to government agencies and elected officials, from growing income disparity to the impact of super PACs, there's a pervasive sense of distrust, of partisan bickering, of failures in governance and leadership, of avoiding shared responsibility for addressing challenges and challenging issues of the day. The University of Maine School of Law is committed to serving as a forum for serious discussion to grapple with these issues, and we have a great audience today. You all are informed, many of you expert in governance. During the question and answer period, I urge you to speak into the microphone that will be handed to you. We actually have more than a packed house. Within a day of our announcing this, we were sold out. We are experimenting with our new technology, and we have an overflow room with a live stream for those who can't be either in the other room with the live stream or here, or for those of you who want to see this event yet again, it will be on video in our website within a couple of weeks. We have an excellent group of panelists today to lead this discussion, and we don't have time for full bios, but believe me, their experience is rich and deep. But let me just name who they are. At the center is Emily Kane. Emily is Minority Leader of the Maine House of Representatives and an important voice in Maine. To her right is John Branson, an attorney in Portland, and among his other clients is Occupy Maine. He's been legal counsel to Occupy Maine. To my immediate left is Peter Mills. Peter is Executive Director of the Maine Turnpike Authority, a longtime leader in Maine government and policy, and most important, a graduate of the University of Maine School of Law. To Emily's left is David Flanagan. David is president of Preservation Management, Inc., a housing management company. He's former CEO of Central Maine Power and a leader in the state. We're honored to welcome all of our distinguished panelists. They have varying perspectives, varying disciplines from law, business, and government, all engaged in the life of Maine. We're especially pleased to welcome Robert Monks, sitting to David Flanagan's left. Bob Monks is a renowned author. He's an expert on corporate governance. He's a leader in the field and a real force for greater equity and justice. In just a few minutes, Bob will present an introduction, essentially a keynote, to set the stage for our panel discussion and audience discussion to follow. Before I give up the podium, let me just thank my colleagues, Lexi Morris, Kayla Ramsey, Kerry Weiler, and a host of others who've helped to make this happen. And of course, my thanks to co-chairs Tom Dunn and Dan Boxer. They're going to moderate the symposium. Tom Dunn was at Accenture for 20 years. He was a partner there since retired. He hasn't been sitting still. He's been engaged in public and nonprofit sectors. He played a lead role in the launch of the Dirigo Health System. He was executive director of Ingraham and led them through a challenging merger. Dan Boxer is the former chief administrative officer of Fairchild Semiconductor, and before that he was a partner at the law firm of Pierce Atwood. Since retiring, he too has not been able to sit still. He's co-founder of Backyard Farms. He's working with a number of different startups, and he teaches courses in the area of governance here at the University of Maine School of Law. So again, I thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to a great discussion. Without further ado, Dan Boxer.
Thanks, Peter. Your experiment with new technology deserves a little bit of an explanation to the people, if they can hear me, in the overflow room. Peter's opening remarks were going to be dramatically emphasized by when you walked in. You were going to see that screen, and on that screen was going to be this this graph that's at the back of the materials you received. And I just love it because it's a Gallup poll. I apologize to people if I'm offending anybody, but it has car salesmen, members of Congress, and lobbyists all tied down the bottom for 70% honesty ranking in the Gallup poll. That was going to be sort of our backdrop for the whole day. But they told me that if we did that, then the people in the overflow room wouldn't hear anything. So we had to make a tough choice. Please take a look at that along with the rest of those materials. If our panelists do their job well, then you won't hear much before during the activity, because hopefully it'll be them, not us. But what I do want to do very briefly, first of all, thanks to Peter and Tom for all the work they've done with me and we've done together over the last year putting this together. It's been a lot of fun, and what I did want to do was say the particular challenge for me, since I've been undertaken to be the one-man governance, business ethics, and corporate social responsibility department here. It's been my challenge to have these symposia connect with what we're doing in the law school and help inform me for how we're going to tinker with next year's course. And I think it's perfectly positioned in that regard, because one of the things that I push in class is that governance is an evolving concept. Two, everything's connected between governance, ethics, and responsible organizations. And three, we don't know which came first. Do well-governed organizations act ethically and responsibly, or you're an ethical bunch of people running an organization, you don't worry about governance because the right decisions will be made? Or if you have a responsibility that's greater than maximizing profits and the bottom line or getting reelected, and you have a responsibility to society, you do not have to worry much about ethics and governance because you're there anyway. So we have those kinds of discussions, and what's exciting to me about this year is I think it's the fourth leg of my stool, and it will be part of that next year, because let's face it, if you don't trust the organization, then it isn't going to be much good in the long haul anyway, whether it's well-governed. Walmart's paper, they were held up as a wonderful governance, sustainability, and ethics program until we read yesterday or Sunday's New York Times. So if the trust isn't there, then all the rest of it doesn't matter, and that's why I'm so excited about today's program. I'm also excited because I need to say a few more words about Bob, who I've followed and admired from afar for many, many years, as he's done on a global and even interplanetary scale. Some of the things that I've done on a local scale. Peter spoke about Bob a little bit, but having followed his career a few years over, so I didn't get the early parts, but I know we're going to hear from somebody who truly is an internationally known figure in the area of governance, political influence, corporate influence on the economy, on the way society works. He's written multiple textbooks on governance. He's written books very recently on business valuation. He's written novels. He's produced documentaries. He has founded what is now the world's largest institutional shareholder advisory company. He's been a senior partner in law firms and a founder of socially responsible investment funds, both in the United States and Europe. And I could go on and on, but I'm going to finish my introduction with Bob by noting that there's an interesting book called Standing on the Sun, which just came out in the last 2 weeks. How the explosion of capitalism abroad will change business everywhere. I I haven't looked this kind of stuff, but I'm reading along, and on page 107, all of a sudden I read this sentence. And this, the lead author of this is the editor of the Harvard Business Review, Julia Kirby. In a rather lurid 2003 documentary called The Corporation, a corporate governance advisor named Robert Monks does a memorable turn describing public companies as externalizing machines, repeating a sentiment he had published previously in the book co-authored with Al Benno. And then it goes on to explain how Bob uses an analogy with sharks and corporations. But here's a fellow who started some very large corporations, been on the board of 10 public corporations, so it's this isn't a spiteful person speaking, it's a knowledgeable person speaking. So I'm interested in what Bob has to say, and Tom is going to take us through the ground rules, and then we'll hear from Bob.
Thank you, Dan. Agenda and obligations. The agenda is Bob's going to do a mini keynote, 15 to 20 minutes, about his latest area of focus, business capture. Each of the panelists is going to be asked to weigh in, 3 minutes plus or minus, their perspectives of this, agree, disagree. We've also asked the panelists to speak not just personally, but also as a business leader, as a politician, as the head of a nonprofit, as a Gen Xer, as an advisor to a cutting-edge mobilization group, as an advocate. Everybody at the panel has a lot of different hats and can offer some very good perspective. Dan and I have a series of questions which are going to sort of lead the conversation forward, but we've encouraged the panel, if they've got a good conversation going and the flow is fine, we won't jump in. Again, the less we speak, perhaps the better off it might be. The starting theme is, how real is the problem? Is it real in Maine? What are some of the root cause issues, and what could we do? Now, in terms of audience obligations, 2 things I'm going to mention. One is that there will be a chance for questions from you to the panelists at the end. We'll save the last 30 minutes. There's microphones that will go out. You raise your hand, we'll call on you, we'll get that taken care of. Second is, I know some are here for CLE, CLU credits, whatever that is that you lawyers have to do, but I also suspect many of you are here for a broader reason. And at the end of the day, everybody here is a current leader or a future leader. You're all going to run something or be on the board of governance of something. We all have a leadership responsibility. My personal hypothesis, is the only time I'll share this now, is that we do have a problem. We continue to have a lack of truth, transparency, and trust. I stole those words when they were talking about Goldman Sachs a few years ago, and it remains the same. We have a problem. But this is a problem that won't be fixed by just someone top-down imposing a solution. This is going to take people working top-down, but also all of us working bottom-up to influence the organizations we're involved with. The obligation for you today is that you come out of here better able, more comfortable talking about the bigger issues, but hopefully personally committed to do one more thing that you're doing already, try and make a difference. I'm up here as a volunteer, as is Dan. We all have an active interest in this, so our request to you is make a little more of a difference when this is done. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob for his keynote. Bob?
Thanks everybody for coming. I can't compete with the weather, but it's really inspirational for me to come to a room and find that there are this many people interested in this subject, as there were many years in which I could have had the dialogue in a telephone booth. And Dan, thank you so much for your generous introduction, about which I would say the moral of that story is if you live long enough, people can find something to say about you, so there it is. I'm going to read, which I don't like to do, because I want to be very careful what I say, and I'm apt, as you can already gather, to be a Betty-Buggin. And so it's best if I constrain myself to something I'll spend some time trying to be sure I was clear about. American corporations today enjoy an absolute reign. They, and they alone, have the power to control the rules under which they function. They have the first say in the allocation of public resources, and they've exempted themselves from nearly all financial obligations to the nation and its people. This is not a prediction of what's to come. This is the present state of affairs. Corporations have effectively captured the United States, its judiciary, its federal judiciary, its political system, and its national wealth, without assuming any of the responsibilities of dominion. Evidence is everywhere. The smoking gun is CEO pay. Compensation is an expression of concentrated power, of enterprise power concentrated in the chief executive officer, and of national power concentrated in corporations. Median U.S. CEO pay for 2010 was up 35% in the midst of a lingering recession, while CEO pay over the last decade has doubled as a percentage of pre-tax corporate income. Yet there's been no justification for current levels of CEO pay based on economic values added. When Lee Raymond retired as CEO of ExxonMobil at the end of 2005, after 6 years at the helm of the merged firm, and another 6 as head of Exxon before that, he walked away with more than $500 million in realizable equity. $500 million. In his final year alone, Raymond received in excess of $70 million in total compensation, an hourly wage of $34,500. No metric can justify such a raid of the corporate treasury and shareholder equity. But Raymond is only a particularly egregious and early example of what has since become common practice. Little wonder that the driving concern of banks receiving TARP bailout money was to pay it back so as to escape any restrictions on executive pay. At the same time as executive pay has mounted so rapidly, retirement risk has been transferred to employees. During the same period that CEOs were doubling their own compensation, the best CEOs of the best companies abrogated the century-old commitment by employers to provide pensions to their workers. IBM has been the corporate leader in abolishing a real pension system for its employees. The 2006 elimination of ongoing defined benefit plans was touted as saving the company as much as $3 billion, while providing it with a more predictable cost structure. But the key message went unspoken. IBM's worker bees were henceforth on their own. It isn't when the retirement thing so much a matter of money. It's when you had a real pension, the company promised it, and the market went to hell. The company had to make it good. So the company bore the risk of the promise. And nowadays, where there are defined contribution plans, the company pays the money in, market goes down, your problem, not the company's problem. No one ever talks about that. They just talk about the money. What really happened here is that the entire sort of social promise of America was diluted by changing a 100-year-old pattern of responsibility for retirement income. This is the essence of capture. CEOs are enriched, while all other corporate constituencies, including government, are left with liabilities. A relatively few autocrats have seized control of the politics and wealth of the United States. The financial power of American corporations now controls every stage of politics, legislative, executive, and ultimately judicial. With its January 2010 decision in the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court removed all legal restraints on the extent of corporate financial involvement in politics, a grotesque decision that can have only one effect, maximizing corporate, not national values. Today's CEOs have been granted the power to direct political payments and organize PAC programs to achieve objectives entirely on their own self-interest, and they've been quick to use it. More than $300 million was invested by corporations in the 2008 presidential election. The totals will be vastly higher in 2012, and the distribution will be politically agnostic. As Bill Myers recently noted, President Obama has raised more money from banks, hedge funds, and private equity managers than any Republican candidate. Capture has further been implemented through the extensive lobbying power of corporations. Abraham Lincoln's mostly forgotten warning about corporations enthroned, and Dwight Eisenhower's famous caution about the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex have both been fully realized in our time. Reported lobbying expenses have risen annually to $3.5 billion in 2010. Half of the senators and 42% of House members who left Congress between 1998 and 2004 became lobbyists. Half of the senators and 42% of the congressmen who left became lobbyists, as did 310 former appointees of George W. Bush and 283 of Bill Clinton. Capture has placed the most powerful CEOs above the reach of the law and beyond its effective enforcement. Extensive evidence of Wall Street's critical involvement in the financial crisis notwithstanding, not a single Wall Street executive has lost his job, and pay levels have been rigorously maintained, even when, as noted above, TARP payments had to be refinanced in order to remove any effective restrictions. While several financial firms had paid civil penalties for their abuses, the amounts involved bear little relation to the malfeasance. U.S. Federal District Judge Jed Rakoff recently and rightly rejected the $285 million settlement agreed to between Citicorp and the SEC as neither fair, nor reasonable, nor adequate, nor in the public interest. Worse, in the financial industry, such fines as have been imposed are basically being paid by the government itself. At the same time that various regulatory agencies boast of record-setting penalties assessed against banks, the Federal Reserve pays banks interest on money that is not being lent, resulting in an interest margin realized by U.S. banks in the first 6 months of last year of $13 billion, more than enough to pay all the penalties. Finally, capture has been perpetuated through the removal of property offshore, where it is neither regulated nor taxed. The social contract between Americans and their corporations was supposed to go as follows. In exchange for limited liability and other privileges, corporations were to be held to a set of obligations that legitimatized the powers they were given. But modern corporations have assumed the right to relocate to different jurisdictions almost at will, irrespective of where they really do business, and thus avoid the constraints of these obligations. As Nicholas Shaxson writes in Treasure Islands, the privileges have been preserved and enhanced, but the obligations have withered. Meanwhile, the U.S. Treasury is estimated to be losing approximately $100 billion annually. Now, beyond the allocation of assets, a far more subtle and pervasive phenomenon now exists. And that is that the language of public dialogue has been kidnapped. So, when you think of capture focusing on particular industries, two powerful Democratic administrations, Clinton's and Obama's, with control over both houses of Congress when they started, have not even been able to propose a system of single-payer health insurance. Now, Obama ran for office on that. Every country in the world has single-payer insurance except the United States, and yet it was not even proposed. The reason is business interests have assured that whatever program of universal coverage emerges will lock in the interests of the insurance and the pharmaceutical industry. So as Americans, you can't buy single payer. You can buy a life insurance policy, you can buy a medical insurance policy, but you can't buy it because the dialogue itself has now gotten so constrained by corporate lobby. History has yet to sort out whether the Second Iraq War served any national objectives beyond military and industrial ones. But the suspicion that oil industries played a critical role in this rush to battle is enhanced by Vice President Cheney's refusal to reveal the names of participants in his Energy Transition Committee. Simultaneously, the inability to force public disclosure of those participants offers a window into how thoroughly the energy industry controls its own agenda, destiny, and information flow. Not only has the industry succeeded in achieving and maintaining special regulatory and tax treatment, in multiple other ways, it functions virtually as an independent state. In that regard, I don't know how many of you saw it in the New York Times about a week ago. There was a picture of Rex Tillerson shaking hands with Vladimir Putin as they were dividing up the North Pole. I spoke earlier about Tillerson's predecessor as head of Exxon, and I went to the annual meeting one year, which is something that is a study in humiliation and expense. And I did get 3 minutes to speak, and I, at that time, was talking about the need for governance of Exxon, as in that corporation, like a lot of them, the CEO is also the chairman of the board. So you mark your own examination papers, you get better grades. And what I said God, I wrote his name down here, memories are bad. Lee Raymond, what I said to Lee Raymond was, I said, I don't mean this in a rude way, but I should refer to you as emperor, because you have more power than any chancellor, any president, any head of the parliament in the world. And so you see, again, the head of the oil company and Vladimir Putin are rivals. I think probably Tillerson has more power. But there it is. Beyond the ones you've thought about, which are say, energy and defense and healthcare, where you know the result of lobbying. You know, but it's hard actually to get your mind around it. Is that the scope of the public discussion doesn't allow you to consider all the issues. There have been constraints. You can only get a corporate answer. Think, for example, of campaign finance. Now, I think almost everybody who has ever been able to think about this has had a eureka moment. And their eureka moment is this. The airwaves in America belong to people. Okay, just let me have that for a minute. The way in which candidates can communicate to the largest number of potential voters is through the airwaves. Right? Why then not avoid problems of constitutional imposition and say, we will give candidates a given number of hours of free airtime if they will agree to restrain other expenditures? John McCain thought that was the greatest idea since sliced bread. It did not get into McCain-Feingold, which of course has been declared unconstitutional since then anyway. But we can't even raise sensible issues because in that case, the local television industry, they're making a fortune out of these things. They're not going to give it up. So why don't people trust? People don't trust because it's not their interest, it's the interest of corporations that are being reflected throughout our society. The final notion that I want to come to is a particular ugliness that has struck me personally, because this is the power of big business through the Chamber of Commerce and through the Business Roundtable to direct government agencies to prosecute companies who are pursuing inconvenient disclosure and business practices. And this happened to me as I started. One of the businesses I started was called Institutional Shareholder Services, a common enough name. And it turned out that it was quite successful, and we give proxy advice to companies. Now, don't understand, what do we give proxy advice? We don't tell companies what to do. We don't even pick the agenda. We have to wait to see what do people put on the proxy, and then we advise them. Well, it turns out that one of the subjects that comes up on proxies is executive pay. And it turns out that everybody else, the board of directors, the compensation committee, the compensation consultants, all of the independent people who give advice, in quotes, we're the only one who actually gives honest opinion. And so therefore, we're now subjected to persecution of having the SEC required to regulate. Now, the last time they regulated the proxy advisory service, about 20 years ago, before we got rid of it, that meant they censored every word. And it takes a long time for censorship to work, so you probably don't get it done on time and all that kind of thing. Well, here was an example of where the Business Roundtable and Chamber of Commerce find somebody is raising issues that aren't convenient, that aren't within their framework. So they have the government to shut you up. I just read the other day, the SEC is so proud they brought a case against a company called Egan-Jones. And do you remember one of the major problems of the financial crisis was the fact that if you want to buy a security, it has to have a securities rating. And so the rating services have pretty good businesses. I mean, I got to tell you, being in business, if people legally have to buy your service, it's a whole lot easier than trying to sell it to them. They had that sort of set of circumstances set up. And guess what? The business model is that the person who is being rated pays the rating company. Well, that's usually a way to get a better rating somehow, don't you think? Well, all that's come up. It's come up in the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission's analysis. It's come up in Carl Levin's hearings in the Senate. Everybody knows it. Okay, finally, the government's come around to taking some prosecutorial action against somebody. They're prosecuting Egan-Jones because they are a tenth of the size of these big companies, and they operate in the business model that the customer has to buy it, not the person being rated. So therefore, they get honest advice, and they don't want to have them in the business. So they're going to drive them out, again, by having the SEC devote its energies in that direction. So it's kind of following a pattern. The first part that I described is fairly familiar to you about lobbying and the use of direct monetary power. The second part may not be as common, but you should think about it, about the extent to which our debate is impoverished. And the third part really is so malignant. I hope it will be a subject of concern in elections. The idea of the business being able to turn the government onto getting rid of inconvenient ideas. Thank you.
Those are powerful words, and it's hard to follow, but David, you've got broad shoulders, so I'm going to ask you to start, and just your reaction to that, but also as a business person, someone who's worked in for-profit, in regulatory industries and things like that, think a little bit too, how pervasive is this? Is it truly a evil Wall Street issue, or does the scope of this go much beyond?
Thanks, Tom. I think Mr. Monks made, Bob made, full disclosure, right? Made at least 10 different indictments against the status quo. And I think that, speaking from a business point of view, I want to take issue with about 8. I think he's got a very good point about Citizens United and where that's likely the risks that has for our polity going forward. But I know I don't have the time to try to respond to all 10. So I'm just going to pick out 2 themes. The first is some of the issues and disappointments that he decried. For example, the shift in the retirement system burden relate to the globalization of the economy, capital going offshore and deserting the United States. We live now, whether we like it or not, we're no longer isolated here in North America with nice tariff boundaries, tariff limitations, and we're exposed to the full brunt of international competition. When we put goods and services on the world market at prices that cannot be sustained, it leads to losses. And it leads to companies having to become more efficient and to reduce their costs where they can. And some of those casualties are people trying to leave the high-cost American tax system and the kind of retirement system that built up after World War II. Just can't afford it anymore and be competitive. The second major theme that I'd like to address is this idea of the corporations coming up with armies of lobbyists and intruding in politics and taking control of the government. The other side of that coin is that since the necessary reforms of the New Deal, American government has become exponentially more involved in the conduct of business. In writing in the Code of Federal Regulations, volumes, encyclopedias of regulations dictating details of how companies are supposed to conduct themselves. And on the state level, as we've done so industriously in Maine, we've followed suit in trying to regulate all the issues that we think are of public concern in corporations. Well, people who are subject to those regulations want to say something about it. They want to have a say in it. If they don't, then the most extreme, costly, burdensome regulations that any particular other advocacy group can dream up are likely to fill that vacuum. So it is a two-way street, and I know a lot of companies feel not controlling government, but oppressed by government. And I think that that's a factor that one ought to take into account when considering why it is that corporations try to get involved in public policy. It's not always because they want to, it's sometimes a purely defensive measure. So with those two perspectives,
Emily, I'll ask you your reaction to this, but also to plant a seed. One of the themes that Bob talked about was language capture. As a politician, I'm sure you're very sensitive to how debates get framed. But What's your reaction?
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. The theme that for me resonates through the entire keynote, and that I think is relevant for today, is what I perceive as a blurring of public and private interests and mission and purpose. And I think we've seen that play out in several of the examples raised by Bob in the way employees are treated. The same as corporations move towards the defined contribution plan, we now see states looking at hybrid models around pensions. We see our own state making changes in the way that we run those pension systems. And in many cases, we have fundamentally different missions. We have fundamentally different purposes, if you will, around the role of government versus the role of corporations, whether the role of profit for those entities. And I think that the question of transparency and accountability comes into this in a big way, because of the heads of government versus the heads of corporations are in different places when it comes to what they have to share, what they're accountable for, what they have to report, and how they are measured, where, you know, whether it's a salary increase versus getting a bonus versus collective bargaining versus an appointment versus freedom of information requests. We are held to different standards, and I think that we're at really a place of crossroads where private industry language, private industry practice, and in some cases the attempts at full privatization of government are running into the level of accountability that we expect from elected officials, that we expect from governing bodies, we expect from state departments, from federal departments, and from the staff that work at those places that run those entities, and where corporations are not held to that standard. And so I think for me, and I'll also make a quick comment about Citizens United, which is something that we're seeing play out now here in Maine, whether it's with our own clean election system, public financing for campaigns, and as we look towards this November 2012 election with a big question mark hanging over it about what will that court decision, how will it actually play out here in Maine as we prepare for elections, and how do we maintain what we want to see as the trust and integrity that elected officials want to put forward as it gets, again, blurred between that interest of private money and private agenda with public interest and accountability.
Thank you. John, your reaction, I also know, given what you've been doing a lot last year, you had a lot of interaction with people where I think a key word was trust, and trust in the system. Just curious, your reaction, the whole themes of how deep, how pervasive is the mistrust today?
Well, it certainly has a lot to do with lack of trust, but also outrage too. I don't want to underemphasize that. I think when one hears Bob talk about this issue, what's most refreshing to me is the unabashed, non-sugar-coated way in which Bob talks about the problems we face as a society. One of the things I commonly attribute to the Occupy movement is the willingness of many people. Bob's been talking this way for a long time, but others well within the mainstream and the establishment being willing to talk in raw, naked terms about the nature of the problems we face that are horrifying in many respects. They make us uncomfortable. They make business and political leaders uncomfortable because folks who are part of the system are generally unwilling to recognize there are problems with it. But I think what we've learned coming out of the financial crisis and the public reaction to it is that there are good people in all sectors of our society who've known about these problems for a long time. They've been unwilling or unable to speak about the corruption for various reasons, but now it's almost as if there's been a freeing up in society of willingness, ability to talk in tough terms about these issues. Certainly with the folks I had the privilege of getting to know, they were outraged not just by the capture of our government that led to the financial crisis, and that goes back to actions really that took place under a Democratic president in the 1990s, the complete dismantling of key provisions of the Banking Act of 1933, which was designed to protect this country from the great collapse that occurred in the Great Depression. a merger had taken place. Citibank had acquired Travelers. Travelers had acquired Salomon Brothers. And this merger was in blatant violation of the Glass-Steagall Act, key provisions of the Banking Act. And now we had Bob Rubin, former Citibank guy, at Treasury, leading the way to pass and act a complete repeal of that act, to retroactively legalize this merger. One of many mergers in which commercial banking, investment banking, insurance, all came under one roof, with obvious conflicts of interest and speculation and practices which combined with the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which helped turn Wall Street into a casino gambling operation once again, was a very predictable bubble and burst where insiders made off with billions of dollars. Those insiders that had slow feet and didn't make out so well were bailed out by the government. And it's not the $750 billion TARP program that comprised most of the bailout. That got most of the public attention. If you research this, you can see that the federal government has committed over $12 trillion to bailing out the nation's largest financial institutions in the form of loans, zero-interest loans, insurance payouts, and other benefits in a way that's been totally outside the public view, with a very predictable result. We've had a Wall Street recovery take place. The Dow Jones, I checked it today, it was over 13,000. That's more than double what it was at its lowest point during the height of the economic crisis in early 2009. So through the intended response of the government, the capture, and I'll just finish with this point, it was not just the capture of government that led to this financial crisis. People are outraged by the capture of the government reflected in the response that took place after the crisis, in which the federal government rushed to the aid of the most powerful corporations that got us into this mess, but have done almost nothing to help the tens of millions of Americans suffering from unemployment, home foreclosures, stagnant wages, and every other thing. During this recession, by the way, the richest 1% have gotten substantially richer. They own 34% of the national wealth prior to this recession. They now are up over 37%. And if you look at incomes, it's even more dramatic that the wealthiest 1% have gotten a lot richer than the rest of us. The Occupy movement was designed to mostly start to get people talking about this and get people involved. These are folks that didn't have the money to participate in this corrupt system. The best they could do was try to create a democratic community of their own, get people to come together and try to be part of a public debate about what to do about it. And certainly corporate personhood and many of the problems that Bob has addressed were front and center in the debate, which is continuing in this country.
And I'm sure we'll come back to that a little bit later. Peter, if I can ask you your reaction in general, and also just to plant a seed, you've been in a situation both in the legislature and where you are, for governance, the role between who's on the board, how the board acts, interaction with the executive director has been a bit of a theme. I know Bob made a couple comments there, but just in general on that, what do you think?
Well, that's sort of it seems like a petty issue in the context of this larger discussion once it's laid out. I don't think there's anything new about Bob's thesis. This goes back to Hamilton versus Jefferson. It goes back to not crucifying people on crosses of gold. It goes back to the progressive era. This country has been in constant tension ever since inception, and I think probably other nations have had similar experiences. But I think because of the wealth of this country, the atmosphere of innovation, the comparable freedoms that we've enjoyed, these tensions between plutocrats and the rest of us are something we're going to have to live with in our society. But I do think I agree with Bob that the balance, we're at a dangerous point. And I think that politically, what drives that danger is, in this environment, is not just the constituency of plutocracy, not just the wealth, not just the rich people, not just the 1%, but I would nominate the elderly as being a source of concern. Bob said, well, we don't have single payer or universal health care. Well, we do. It's for everybody my age and older. And people my age, I've got mine. And there are more and more and more people over 65 living. I just went to the funeral last night. A woman was died at the age of 95. And I'm sure she voted right up until the end. And so the political power resides not only where the money is, but also where there are people who are living in Boca Raton quite comfortably, thank you, at age 65 and above. And then I'll add in a third constituency that makes it very, very difficult to do anything about Bob's agenda. There's a growing population of people who are fully dismayed at the very notion of complexity, and who will search out easy answers wherever they can find them, because life is so very challenging. And they find it, for some reason, in the last book of the New Testament. I don't know why they don't read the others. But there are those who say that those of us up here might have been better off if the South had won the Civil War, because those people would all be somewhere else. I'm on the right, that's all right. But I mean, it prevails in those southern states. I mean, it was the source of Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, probably. And so I think in terms of trying to rebalance the stage here politically and trying to bring the nation back into bring these tensions together, I think we're facing larger demographic challenges than we have in years past. And part of it we brought on ourselves. I mean, what America has to sell to the rest of the world, particularly in an environment where we're exporting our workforce and our manufacturing and lots of other things. The reason that we've been successful, a big reason we've been successful, is that the New York Stock Exchange is a highly regulated place. You can put your money in there and, for the most part, trust what's happening to it and how it's reported. Now, Bob makes the case that that's not entirely true, but try investing your money somewhere else, and you will run into similar challenges that are perhaps even deeper. So we trade. I mean, the stock in trade here in the United States of America is our integrity, and we are in danger of losing it. I adopt that thesis, but we need to recover it for a very selfish reason. It's the source of our wealth. It's the source of our democracy. It's the source of many things. So I think integrity is important. Once one trial lawyer once told me, once you can fake that, you can.
Peter, I'm gonna burst in now because I don't want to miss it. I want to pick up from something you said, because there's a thread here that I want to have us continue. And incidentally, I think what we just all heard here was worth the price of admission. It was just a wonderful dialogue here. We've learned a lot, but we're not going to let you go on yet. Bob, you outlined a lot of, I think, pretty irrefutable changes. Things are different. Things are different in terms of lobbying, in terms of money in the system, in terms of revolving doors, in terms of globalization. I mean, this is different. We didn't have Citizens United a couple of years ago, income inequality. So my question, and I really want to start, I don't want to insult anybody, but with Generation Y or X or whatever, Emily and John are that the rest of us aren't. It's going to hit you more than the rest of us. So the question really I have is, if you assume these things are there, and we do have a system where some of the checks and balances aren't quite what we thought they were going to be, or David may disagree, how deep is this malaise? And I'll kick it off by saying, if we got down 5% unemployment and wages recovered and they were no longer stagnating, and we solved a foreclosure problem and the normal number of homes are underwater, so people are saying I feel good about the economic times. All these problems, the issues that we talked about affecting the system. First, kick it off with you and John. Maybe we'll just leave it at that and get to another question. Your generation, are they going to say that's fine, let's go back to work and make money and buy things, or do you think it's deeper than that?
Thank you for the question. Whether it's my age or not that qualifies me to answer it is yet to be
You're just
seen.
going to have to put up with a lot longer.
I think the word which was raised by John, the word of outrage, I think is what comes to mind first. Because I think there's a lot of outrage. But I don't necessarily think it's focused on one particular thing that then implies there's a direct fix to the outrage. And I think that is what's really embedded in all of the things that were mentioned by Bob, is there's a lot to be angry about. But they're big things. And the question is, who or what is going to ultimately lead to the hitting of the reset button? Because I think whether you're talking about foreclosure or unemployment, whether you're talking about the wage gap, I particularly look at it through the lens also of the education gap and the access to education, the access to opportunity that comes from where you live, where you can go to school, the type of upbringing that you have, the level of complexity that you're willing to engage with voluntarily or through the mentoring of others. That question of outrage, I think the outrage remains. The question is how much of it becomes normal. Because I think what I've seen in my 8 years in Augusta is the tolerance level for the amount of outrage one carries around with them on a daily basis, which I think everyone does, whether it's at a stoplight or it's at corporate greed, is increasing. Our own personal tolerance for the amount of outrage we carry around every day because the problems are so complex and there is not a clear and direct path to fixing them. I think the Occupy movement expresses that in a lot of ways, where it's collective outrage, but not necessarily all the same thing, and not necessarily with an easy fix. So as I look ahead as to what may or may not be coming down the road, I think it comes back to the question which is embedded in Peter's anecdote about the person in Boca Raton, which is, at what point do you fear losing something enough that you are willing to make a change or willing to affect a change? Because I think it does come back to that sense of the individual for even the most globally minded person. When it comes to actually taking an action, there's got to be some level of individual accountability and impact. And so that's where I think it's tough for government to just provide the answer. I think it's tough for corporations to provide the answer, and I think it's tough for general society. There's got to be something that gets us all outraged enough that we are going to all express or potentially have a sense of something we lose that I think will inspire the ultimate change. What that is, I don't know. That's obviously a lot of big picture stuff, but from where I sit, I'm waiting to find something that gets us all angry enough that we'll actually do something about it.
I would just briefly add, there is a lot of outrage, but when you're talking about young people, outrage is still preferable to cynicism, because cynicism tends to be what paralyzes it. And I'm more of a Generation Xer. I've become a lot more cynical than I once was when I was 20 years younger. And what I really saw in my clients was the flip side of the outrage was a great sense of optimism and hope. This Occupy movement gave them a sense of empowerment that they hadn't felt in a long time. The Occupy movement, unlike the movement of the 60s, these weren't predominantly overprivileged kids coming together who didn't have to work and had time to protest. Most of them came from middle and lower income backgrounds. If they were trying to get an education, they were also having to work at the same time. And given what happened with the economic crisis, they just felt there was a sense of despair. But with Occupy, they came together with a sense of empowerment that they could at least start take steps to get the rest of society to pay attention to the problem and start talking about it. There weren't any preconceived solutions. What made Occupy unique and so empowering for people is it was totally bottom up. This wasn't conceived by George Soros in some conference room at MoveOn.org. You know, when people came to Monument Square, they said, what are you guys protesting? What do you stand for? People were handed a blank piece of cardboard and a Sharpie. And, you know, it's like we planted a seed in the ground. If you want to know what this is going to look like, you know, help us water it, nurture it, come to our General Assembly meetings. A great sense of hope prevailed. And I think that's the most important thing. And they've seen, they haven't achieved any sort of, you know, easily measurable objectives, but just the way the debate has changed, what President Obama has chosen to make his campaign about, interestingly, you know, lots of different ways we've seen the effects of the movement, and folks are starting, town councils and state legislatures around the country have passed resolutions calling on Congress to amend the Constitution to repeal the effect of Citizens United. Many of them go further and say, repeal the idea of corporate personhood altogether. So this is all new. It gives hope that there are solutions.
America's best days behind it?
I certainly don't think so. And I think, you know, if you ask folks around the country, you know, I mean, a lot of the problem with these polls that we do and we hear the results are, I mean, I think the first step is get more people involved in concrete ways coming together to debate the issues of the day, rather than doing polls of what people think while they're watching TV and sitting on their couch. I think you got to change public attitudes first before you can really diagnose how much hope there is out there.
Was your question, isn't America's Best Days behind it? Absolutely not. Oh, there's more resources. Oh, but no, there's more resources available to us. It's a matter of how do we use them. And the whole world is available to us now when it wasn't before, in a way that's literally in my iPad right here. You know, and the question is, what do you do with it when you have so much information that it becomes a sense of, oh my goodness, what do we do? How do we move this forward? I think the resources are there. I think it's an untapped potential, but I think the potential is there.
I think people on average think they are behind us. I think when I go door to door and meet people, particularly older people, who just sit there and they shake their heads and they say, Peter, we've seen the best of them. That's a quote from there.
John, I think you talked about the movement. I'd like to suggest to you that you really have a very logical next step. The next step is voluntarism. And what the movement can be taken at a very simple level as being is people have thought there was a problem sufficiently large to volunteer their own time and energy without any hope of reward. Voluntarism, something that used to be quite important in this country. And I think a way of understanding how important it is to restore voluntarism is to take a theme from a book that's written by my favorite journalist, a woman named Rachel Maddow, and about how much too easy it is to go to war. And just without going overboard about something, I'd like to have written the book too, but she's smarter than I am. And here is really the serious problem. And my wife Millie and I have said this for the last 30 years. First, if either any of our children, and now if any of our grandchildren, were drafted, would we be in Iraq? Would we be in Afghanistan? I mean, I am diminished as a citizen because of the fact that it doesn't personally affect me. And I believe the only way we can move on is to take the lead from John's group